I'm delighted to be invited to speak and offer a British perspective on the threats to the rule of law and how it is breaking down, and how that is breaking down in my home country today. When I was first invited to speak at this conference, I thought I would have the opportunity to offer some thoughts and ideas that might be put to use by the Conservative Party before a general election in the autumn. Unfortunately, things have changed, and Britain goes to the polls on the 4th of July. I'm sad to say it looks overwhelmingly likely that the Labour Party will form the next government, and they will likely accelerate the damaging themes and the erosion of the rule of law that I'm going to explore today, and indeed everyone's been exploring in their own countries throughout this conference. It has not been broken yet, I don't think. Maybe I'm slightly optimistic to answer the first question, but it is certainly fraying, and I'm not particularly optimistic about the future, particularly under a genuinely left-wing government, rather than the sort of accidentally left-wing government we have right now. I'm neither a lawyer or a constitutional expert. I'm a political actor first and foremost, having served as a special advisor in the Conservative government working with Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg on his legislative and parliamentary affairs, and as well as working on Brexit and civil service reform. And I'm also a bit of an amateur historian, so do forgive me where I bring in a little bit of a British history lesson here, because I think there's some distinct issues about British history and legal tradition which is worth looking at here. So, on to the how, Sebastian's second question. Britain's tradition of rule of law is slightly different to Europe's. That doesn't need explaining in much detail to this audience, as you certainly all know. You will be aware of the common law, the ancient English conception of liberty, and the fact that we had, until the 20th century, an astonishingly lightly regulated and lightly governed country. A.J.P. Taylor's very famous and often quoted line about how little the British man of 1914 interacted with the state in his daily life, essentially the post office and occasionally the policeman, was true, and it highlighted a society which was at once highly liberal but also highly ordered and peaceful. But the demands of the wars of the 20th century ensured the growth of the state, which put unprecedented demands on the British people consequently. Conscription, the nationalisation of industry, the prying eyes of the surveillance state, and a war economy, essentially war communism, changed Britain forever. In the Ancien Regime and the Revolution, Alexis de Tocqueville remarks enviously at Britain never operating an armed mounted police force over its own population, unlike the much more authoritarian France. This is something we lost in the 20th century, I think, and never to return. And it has an interesting effect on the rule of law and the way it is felt by the public intuitively. Britain has had a tradition of implementing very few laws, simply and clearly written. There's a great elegance and clarity to Victorian law. If you do look through the statute books of the laws that we still do have on the books from the 19th century, and even in the medieval era, some laws are still in force, they are written beautifully simply, unlike the horrible consultation mess of European-style law we write today. And these laws were enforced fairly, robustly, and transparently, most importantly. Laws, once written and forced, come with great weight. They are delivered by an elected parliament, which is the supreme lawmaking body in the country. There is no higher authority than the higher court than parliament. That means that what laws we do enforce must be treated with utmost respect and severity. That is, of course, of great importance in England, considering our legal philosophy, in which supposedly everything is permitted unless it is explicitly stated otherwise in law. So Britain exists in a sort of regulated anarchy, rather than you have to have permission to leave the house, as you did in France and by written consent during the pandemic. That means to legislators to limit the liberty of the citizenry, and therefore it must be done sparingly and with absolute seriousness. With a remarkably homogenous population and a unified national culture, whether that's from the kinship of the British people, a generally quite unified religious creed, our island geography protecting us from the wars of the European mainland, particularly the 30 Years' War, Britain was governed as much by assumption and custom as it was by law. You might be able to see where I'm going with this when we look at Britain as the modern Britain today, which is a multicultural nation, one which doesn't have quite the same assumptions holding it together. And this also is reflected in Britain's changing approach to legislation. It is neither serious, sparing, nor is it done with much regard for the populace's inherent liberty or the importance of their freedom. And this is where we see very many similar problems in Britain, as the other panellists today and speakers yesterday have talked about their countries in Europe. Today we have an increasingly undemocratic state, or rather the democracy we do have is quite cosmetic. We have a parliament full of parliamentarians who are unaware of their constitutional privilege and sovereignty, or even treat it with disdain, a political culture strangled by a legal web of rights which often contradict each other, and they entrench a progressive orthodoxy, and a regulatory state which insists on rulemaking instead of custom and enforcement in bans, and the regulatory state which increasingly operates against democracy and without parliamentary oversight. Most damaging of all is that the state has continued to grow and tries to regulate ever more of our lives. Its capacity to actually do so is weakening, and it is enforcing its laws unfairly, asymmetrically, and often in a way which feels arbitrary, where the law-abiding British population comes off worst. These issues are combining to create a crisis in the rule of law and a condition of anarcho-tyranny in the United Kingdom. Thing is, some people have been saying this is happening in Britain for a long time. This was first observed by Lord Hewitt, who wrote a polemic called The New Despotism. He claimed that the courts and the civil service were eroding parliamentary democracy and assuming de facto lawmaking power, and he wrote this as early as 1929. I cannot say whether it was true then. Probably wasn't true, but it certainly is true now. And 4 things have contributed to this, and I think the 4 things I'm going to discuss will point to the consequences, which addresses Sebastian's third question. The first one in the modern era is the host of Blair-era constitutional reforms, most significantly the Human Rights Act of 1998, but also the Constitutional Reform Act of 2005, which was addressed by one of the speakers yesterday, and the 2010 Equality Act. What these have done is they have eroded Britain's tradition of equality under the law as an individual and attempted to bring in separation of powers, an American or a European concept, not a British concept, and the rule of judges rather than by democracy. One thing that's been really quite pernicious, how it's developed in case law over the last 15 years, is what the Equality Act has done. That broke down the British people into 9 separate protected characteristics. What this means is you are no longer an individual. I am no longer Fred de Fossard, British citizen. In fact, I am Fred de Fossard who has, I might be able to grab one of 9 protected characteristics, and that can form my identity. So those will be race, those gender, religious affiliation, all that sort of thing. The most dangerous thing about that is that you stop being an individual and you essentially assume a group identity, which also, very importantly, can be a group identity you can claim solidarity with across the entire world. So it's a very anti-national concept as well as an anti-individualistic one. And naturally, we've been talking about the rule of lawyers. This has been a boon for lawyers because it's given us an entirely new legal industry, an entirely new web of making lawsuits, an entirely new way of suing people. So we've seen the growth of a sort of compliance and regulatory and legal state following these kind of regulations. The second issue has been the British state's response to the Brexit referendum. This was absolutely fascinating to watch unfold in real time. The referendum to vote when Britain voted to leave the European Union was the largest exercise in democracy in Britain's history. Yet, of course, you will have seen half our parliament didn't want to do it. Our regulatory state, our civil service, certainly didn't want to do it, and all manner of horrible tricks were thrown in the way, which eventually led to the sort of near explosion of populist anger, which was tempered and harnessed brilliantly by Boris Johnson's 2019 election victory. Of course, it's a bit sad talking about Boris's 2019 election victory because the promises haven't quite come true, but we'll touch on that later. But what it has meant is that we've left the European Union constitutionally. We are no longer bound by the European Court of Justice, which is fantastic. We are unfortunately still bound by the European Court of Human Rights, which is an ongoing issue. But we haven't rewired the British state accordingly. So, for example, our regulators. We have two big regulators that I write about a fair bit. One, the Financial Conduct Authority, which regulates our financial services, and 2, the Competition and Markets Authority, which is our antitrust regulator. When we were in the EU, these bodies worked within the context of the EU, where they basically responded to the European Commission and British Parliament had nothing to do with it. That was not democratic, but that was how the European Union worked. We have now left the European Union, but these bodies act as if we never did. And this is steadily causing a rule of law issue, if not crisis, certainly a rule of law problem. Because these bodies, which essentially have lawmaking power, particularly the FCA, which literally makes policies like it's now trying to mandate diversity quotas on private companies working in the financial services sector, these regulators are able to do this without parliamentary oversight. And this is hardly the sort of deliverance of taking back control on which the British people voted for when they voted to leave the European Union. Indeed, this is where the real rule of law crisis comes in. It is not a Conservative government trying to prorogue Parliament to deliver the Brexit referendum, but in reality it is a failure of our entire regulatory state, the civil service, Whitehall and our political class to actually deliver Brexit, which is the real root of the rule of law crisis. As I said earlier, we regulate, we legislate, and we don't even have the capacity to enforce these policies. In the area of criminal justice, for example, we introduce new sentences all the time, new special convictions. You can have a special sentence if you kill an emergency worker. So you're not just sent to jail for murder, you're sent to jail for killing a paramedic. Obviously, killing paramedics is very bad, but I don't think it needs to be a separate type of legal offence. But then, of course, we don't even have enough prison space to put people in jail. So on the one hand, we do a round of tougher sentences, and on the other, we're actually letting people out of jail because we haven't built enough prison capacity anyway. So and if you're a member of the public, you will suddenly realise these things don't match up. This is where the rule of law begins to break down, because we see the state talking tough on one side and not delivering at all, and in fact acting in the complete opposite way. And this will steadily erode trust in the criminal justice system and the British state as a whole. And now onto the pandemic, which we've touched on a little bit, and the way in which Britain decided to enforce its lockdowns. Now, of course, I've mentioned earlier parliamentary sovereignty. It is the supreme lawmaking body in Britain. And some people accuse Conservatives of wanting to be a sort of authoritarians with Parliament, treat it like an elected dictatorship. So I'm not going to say the Parliament should have unlimited powers to act to erode the liberties of the public, because certainly the way it behaved during the pandemic was extraordinary. It passed the legislation to put us into lockdown in one day. It passed hundreds, possibly thousands of secondary instruments, often without a vote, which then continued lockdown measures, banned certain businesses from opening, and we all remember the pandemic, and we all know how terrible it was. Indeed, there were no human rights concerns raised during the pandemic. The web of sort of left-wing lawyers who will always campaign on behalf of criminals or asylum seekers or illegal immigrants about their human rights if we want to try and deport them were remarkably silent about the human rights of the entire population when we put them into lockdown, which I did find rather extraordinary. The police forces acted in a tyrannical way. There was one extraordinary example of Derbyshire police force in the early days of the pandemic sending drones up into the Peak District, a beautiful stretch of countryside in the Midlands of England, and filming people going for walks, saying that is not essential, you need to go back home. And they blasted this all over their social media. And it was an extraordinary example of a police force getting high on their new powers. And I don't think they have recovered the public trust ever since. And the lockdowns then leads me on to my next point, which I think is the most pernicious, which is the way the state has handled different types of protests since 2020. While the entire population was locked inside, Black Lives Matter protests happened in May 2020. The police did nothing to stop them. Indeed, many police officers took the knee in front of Black Lives Matter protesters who protested down Whitehall, which is the main street of the British government. Then, of course, we've seen since last year the way in which the police have handled the pro-Hamas demonstrations in London. With light touch, to say the least. The police at one point decided to equivocate over whether calling for jihad was a crime. And indeed, at one point, one of the official police Twitter accounts said there are many different meanings of jihad, and we don't know whether they were calling for holy war or just talking about the sort of personal struggle meaning of jihad. So therefore, no offence was committed, and these protesters were allowed to continue. Yet, of course, when Remembrance Day came along on the 11th of November, a Palestine protest was planned for that day. That is obviously the time when we remember the fallen in the First World War and all other wars. So a group of patriotic counter-protesters decided to plan a march and stand around the war memorials to protect against potential threats of vandalism, which happened in the Black Lives Matter protests 3 years before. The police arrested all of them. They arrested all of them under the breaches of the King's Peace, which essentially means that if you're going to cause trouble and other people might want to attack you, we will arrest you because it's easier to arrest you because you're a small group and they're a much bigger group. And to be honest, they're a much more politically connected group and they have a much bigger web of sort of activist lawyers, campaigning organisations to campaign on their behalf, whereas the sort of ragtag bunch of right-wing football hooligans certainly don't have that kind of sort of lawfare infrastructure behind them. So So I think that was an extraordinary moment where we've seen the annihilation, or we are seeing the annihilation of trust in the law, because we're realizing quite quickly that it works in favour of some people and not in others, and we are certainly not treated as individuals equal under the law. So I do think this is going to get worse, and it will especially get worse if we have a Labour government, which it looks likely we will in July. The leader of the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer, is a human rights lawyer and a civil servant by trade and by instinct. And his human rights lawyer instincts really do go deep, and it's how he sees the world, it's how he sees the country, and it's how he sees his approach to injustice. His instinct is always to support the supposedly marginalised against the democratic will of the nation. Just see his party's approach to the British government's attempt to finally get on top of illegal immigration. Indeed, he campaigned and put his name to a letter against the deportation of a group of foreign criminals to Jamaica in 2020. That deportation flight fell apart because of the political campaign waged by him and many other Labour MPs, and then one of the men who was due to be deported then went on to kill someone. So it's a really interesting, it was really perfect analogy of how we have the democracy of wanting to control our borders and keep our nation safe is being subverted by this lawfare culture. Another thing he will do, which will damage the rule of law, is he is likely to continue Gordon Brown's constitutional vandalism. He will erode democracy further, with a plan, apparently, to ask the Supreme Court to adjudicate between disputes between the House of Commons and the House of Lords. If we do that, then we are going to find ourselves in very much an Israeli situation where the Supreme Court and the chairman of the Supreme Court essentially becomes the real king in Britain, if they are the only person able to judge between a dispute between the two houses of our legislature. Furthermore, they've suggested they might introduce things called citizens' assemblies, which is entirely outside Britain's tradition of policy making, where the state and civil society and NGOs will handpick a group of 100 citizens to agree thorny political issues, and we can imagine what their conclusions will be, and then they will become law. So I do think dark times are ahead. The Conservative Party and the British Conservative movement very much needs to think on why it failed in office to protect the rule of law and to obviously deliver its promises to the public. And it needs to have a sort of constitutional reformist or perhaps constitutional restoration movement. Especially as I think that this will be on fertile territory, as I think the trust in the rule of law will genuinely begin to collapse, and it will destroy the entire concept which we have spent the last 1,000 years building. Thank you very much.